Writing a book is a big thing in the Alexander Technique world. It's generally this distillation of everything that you've got to offer and your take on Alexander Technique and directing and stories from your students. In a lot of ways, my YouTube channel is that because I think that the video format just works better for something that really gets a lot of benefit from visual demonstration. I think that if I ever were to write a book, it would be on the ways in which my career as an Alexander Technique teacher has proven to me over and over and over that toxic masculinity is bad for men too. This is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today we're talking about men's health and the ways that that shows up in my students. So this originally came up as a result of people occasionally asking me about demographic trends within my students. So across genders and socioeconomic statuses and various different things, what are patterns? Do I see patterns coming up? The short answer to a lot of that is no, not really. There aren't a whole lot there. It's not like, people who grew up poor move differently than people who didn't. I don't see a whole lot of those differences going on. I sometimes see trends across people who are physically built in a way that requires them to interact with their environment in a particular way. Like there are tall, skinny people habits that generally anybody over about 6'2", who's also quite thin and very bendable, most of them do this set of things. Things like that. There's one exception to this. And it's a group that has an alarming trend, and I think is also very relevant to what we're seeing happen in various different societies around the world, particularly here in the US. There is a trend that I see with my students who are men. We're going to get specific here, and I'm specifying for the most part cisgender men, so men who were assigned male at birth and were raised as boys and became men and still identify as men. Men who are either current or former athletes who are sensitive. And I don't say sensitive as a negative thing. I just mean folks who are going to feel a little bit more. And they're going to be maybe a little bit more aware of the impact of stress and worry on themselves. That's what I mean by sensitive. So another term that we could use for that potentially is emotionally aware, sort of, but they don't always have the training to be able to identify what it is that they're actually feeling and what's happening and what's causing problems for them. So that's why I say sensitivity as more an inherent state of being rather than something that has required training to become aware of. So the profile of this person that I've seen quite a few of these coming in through my office is these guys who have a lot of muscle mass because they have a background in athletics. Oh my God, they're hurting themselves. Really bad. The way that this kind of presents is a lot of these guys that come in, they're not necessarily talking about anxiety or stress when they come in because that's normal for them, and that's become so normalized that they're taught to not talk about it. And then over the course of their lessons with me, in Alexander Technique, we don't differentiate between the mind and the body, even as two different things that are connected. We talk about the whole self. Your emotions are as relevant to me and our work as the amount of neck tension that you've got, because they are not different things. The more that we learn in scientific and medical research, which needs to maintain its funding, the more that we learn about these things, the more that becomes quite evident. The long-term medical impacts and health problems that come with sustained stress are very measurable. And they're especially noticeable in people who are told that they are not allowed to get help for this because you just need to man up and deal with it. And here's where we get into the social conditioning piece to this. I was raised as a girl, and I identify as a girl. I was assigned, female, woman, gonna be a woman at birth, so that makes me cisgender. So that's where that term comes from. People who were raised as boys and then over their lifetimes continue to identify as boys get this messaging so strongly that showing emotions is not acceptable, that asking for help is showing weakness, that doing something like carrying your own child is somehow not manly enough. That's been an interesting one to see popping up on social media occasionally. The idea of these like the manosphere influencers who are just blatantly, advertising and advocating for assault of women and non-binary and trans people as well. The ways that I see those horrendous human beings having an influence on people who don't even purposefully subscribe to those ideas, and they might even really ideologically disagree, and they're still getting impacted by this through the cultural expectations on behavior. We can't really differentiate between culturally learned behaviors and behaviors that are inherent to the individual as far as, what effect does it have on you? It's still going to impact you. It's still relevant, and it still is going to come up in your Alexander lessons. Because if you come into your lessons with the understanding, whether that is, part of who you are as an individual in your person, right? This nature versus nurture argument doesn't really matter because it's still impacting you. So, the reason that I want to get into this, and I think it is a conversation worth having, is I think this gets left out of some of the conversations. In every sense of the word, I would identify myself as a feminist in the sense of promoting women's equality and women's health and all of those pieces, and I don't like the term because I think that the terms that we use impact the way that we think about them. And so even though the definition of feminism is what I support, it's not a term that I use very readily about myself. I'm much more likely to say that I support true gender equity and actual equality. Because that doesn't just mean that the aspects of people who are socialized women gets raised up. It also means that the aspect of people who were socialized as men also needs to get addressed because that affects us too. One of the worst things, I think, for women is to have to deal with the impacts on men of what has happened to them. And it's, there's an aspect to this that you could totally dive into as far as like who's doing the emotional labor of this and who does this fall to. But at the end of the day, I'm much more interested in, okay, now what? What do we do about this? Here's the ways that I see it coming up with my students. I had a student who I was doing table work with him. He had not come in talking about anxiety at all. It wasn't on his intro list. I have a whole information sheet that I take of all my students on day one when they come in. And that includes like mental health concerns or just anything helpful you think would be, good for me to know about you. A lot of students will talk about like mental health diagnoses and stuff like that with that question. This person did not. And then I worked with him a full 30-minute lesson on the table. And then when he sat up again after we had just spent nearly half an hour working with ease and regulation and self-awareness and just having time to have permission to exist, he sat up and he looked around as if he was looking for something that was missing. And I said, hey, what's going on? What are you responding to? And he said, does Alexander technique help anxiety? I said, yeah, it can for sure. What are you experiencing? And he said, it's not there. It's just like it's not there right now. And he had such a strong response to this that he was physically looking around as if there was something had been looming over him for years and it had settled. And he had been given time to let that settle, and it was something that he had literally never experienced. A different student who was the one who really made me solidify this and identify, here's what I'm looking at here, is kind of the classic example. He had done baseball at a pretty competitive level before he ended up going to music school, and then he was going through grad school here, and he had basically sustained an overuse nerve injury in his arm. So he had just been constantly pulling so much. And he's not all that much taller than me, but has, probably double my muscle mass. He's just he's built like an athlete. And he started to really notice the impact of how much he was tensing himself, and he couldn't get himself to even be able to start addressing letting go of that. So I was working with him on it, and started to really identify hey, so I'm seeing you being able to tense the amount of muscles that you have to an extent that you are physically causing yourself damage. And he looked at me and said, "That sounds right." And I told him, okay, well, are you open to the idea of kind of letting go of that idea of this is who you are as a person that will take on challenges for yourself and just tighten in order to make it through something? And he blinked and said, "Yeah, I think I probably need to address that." So what I did is, over time, I kept working with him. He came back for I think 3 rounds of lessons with me. So rounds of lessons with the university here, the way that their classes are set up, each term is 10 lessons. So he got up to 30 lessons with me by the end, which is a pretty good amount. And there was one time where I chose my moment very deliberately. And he still hadn't really been able to let go of a lot of this stuff. I waited until we were doing wall work, which is where the student has their back against the wall. And in this situation with how my room is set up, he had physically nowhere to go. And I cornered him against the wall, because there's another wall on this side and then a desk over here. And so he's right here. And I kind of cornered him physically, not in physical contact with him, but just you cannot get away from this right now. There is no escaping what we're about to talk about. And I looked him in the eye, and I used his name. I'm going to assign a fake name here. I'm going to call him Josh. I looked him in the eye and said, "Josh, you cannot hurt yourself into fixing this. If you could do that, it would have worked by now." And that hit him hard. He turned red, flushed, and his mouth pulled back into he kind of wanted to smile and laugh it off, because that's how he's been taught to deal with this. But it kind of turned into kind of a grimace, and tears came up in his eyes. And I let that sit for a couple of seconds, and then I figured that was enough, so I physically backed off. I gave him room to breathe. After a couple of seconds, I made a joke and made him laugh, and helped kind of diffuse his activation that way. And starting the next week, he started to have more progress and more consistent breakthroughs in his work with regulating himself and being able to use self-control on the deliberately less muscle tension side of things. The final example I want to use for this is a student who was older. This was in my private practice, so not a university student here. And he was a lifelong athlete and musician, and did lots of different things, and very here. This is where we're at, and this is what it means to be myself. There's so much of this identity piece tied in. I am a person who does this and is there all the time. And I had to really ask him about that a lot, and ask a lot of questions with do you feel like that is helping you? Do you feel like that is necessary? What do you feel like that brings you? This is one of the times where my role as an Alexander technique teacher is very therapy adjacent. because I find that if we don't ask these questions, if we don't encourage emotional intelligence alongside body intelligence, we're missing a major part of the story. If a student, especially one he's in his, 50s to 60s, lifelong athlete and, big musician, huge presence in a room. If someone like that has never had a chance to work through how does your identity impact how you're organizing yourself, how are they supposed to ever release some of this stuff? How are they ever supposed to start to learn this? These are conversations that I find are much more common to have as a person who was raised as a woman. And that's one of the reasons I want to draw attention to this, that I see an area in which men are really being left behind. And it's hurting everyone, because what we're seeing, on a society-wide level here in the US is, the epitome of toxic masculinity coming down from on high in the White House, and people who are bragging about assaulting women and calling that locker room talk and saying that, oh, it's fine, right? This is just how it is, and this is what it means to be a man, right? Here's this identity piece where behavior equals identity. I reject that, I challenge that on every level, and I think that that has to come from every level of society saying, no, it doesn't have to be that way. I think that one of the best ways we can start to address this is just on an interpersonal level, and giving men in your life a chance to actually talk and asking them questions about how they're feeling. And, hey, would you like support with this? Actually being there emotionally for, folks who have been told that it is socially unacceptable to do that. So, where I want to wrap up this conversation for now, I might have more to say about this in the future. Where I want to wrap this up for now is encouraging folks to think about men's health as being a piece of the problem of gender equality in general. When men are being told that there is weakness inherent in kindness, they're not going to be kind to anybody, including us. We have to teach that community and kindness brings strength, and that is masculine strength. Otherwise, this is going to keep happening. I don't see a solution to this just occurring on its own. It has to come from people deciding to break those cycles of, socialized behavior and what is expected of people. I think it is improving a little bit, and that's part of why we're seeing such an intense backlash from the other side of the spectrum. When I go to parks now, I'm much more likely than when I was a kid 30 years ago to see dads at the park with their kids, pushing a stroller. A dad with a baby strapped to himself. That really didn't happen in the 90s in Georgia. That was like, I don't think I'd ever seen that before I came out to Colorado. Men can be nurturing. Men can be kind. And men can be kinder to themselves. And I think that's really important, and it's missing for us. Alexander Technique can be a way to get in touch with that. It can be a way to start noticing the mental and physical, right, whole self integration of who are you as a person and what does that mean about your behavior, including your behavior towards yourself. How are you organizing yourself? How are you holding yourself? I think it is desperately needed, and it's one of the things that can actually be done by everybody. I don't think you need any sort of specialized training in order to do this. I have the specialized training to be able to see the impacts of it when it does come up, but I didn't do anything in particular to make that happen, and I am not a trained therapist, so I didn't dive into it, with those students that I talked about in these stories. I didn't dive into it any more than I've just described. Just to have these little moments of I see you. I see what's happening, I acknowledge you, I care about you, and I support you. for these students made a big difference. So I encourage you this week to find a man in your life and ask him how he's doing. And not just settle for a, what are you doing at work? Or like, what home project are you working on in your garage? You know, the classic boy questions. How are you? Like, how are you actually doing? How are you feeling? How are you feeling about what's happening in the world today? Give them a space to talk. It's been really encouraging to see that happening more often with the students that I'm working with who, of course, at a music school trend quite progressive. And, you know, easily a third of my students are LGBT, easily. So there's already a lot more like gender fluidity here and a lot less like really strict gender roles within the performing arts world, which I love and is great. The best example of that, I had a student who's a woman come into her lesson. This was in my private practice, and she was a little bit older, so like late 30s, early 40s. And she came in and she said, I love Gen Z so much. I was in the elevator and there were two boys who were just standing around talking about emotions. It's the best part of my day. Truly wonderful. So, encourage your boys to have emotional intelligence, to ask, how are we handling things? And how are we regulating ourselves? And can we have room for kindness being a source of strength rather than kindness as a source of weakness? Give it some thought. See if that's something that you can incorporate more into your life and your social dynamics, your relationships with real people.